Hello, my name is Safradu Salmon Mujage from Edukea, Tanzania. Welcome in this new session, which is concerning with history Form 5. It is the fourth topic in Form 5 history, which is from colonialism to the First World War. It means from 1880s to 1914. So we are going to see the fourth topic, and our topic I would like to introduce to you. It has two subtopics according to our syllabus. It has two subtopics which we are going to see in our topic. The first subtopic is the Colonial States, and the second one is reasons for adoption of various colonial agricultural systems. So these are the subtopics which we are going to deal with. And let us go direct to the first subtopic, which is the Colonial States. The Colonial States, by the definition, refer to the extension of the metropolitan state in the colony. It means that Colonial States refer to the extension of the metropolitan states in the colony. The colonial states was established immediately after scramble for and partition of Africa. It means that the colonial states was established soon or immediately after scramble for and partition of Africa. It was followed by the establishment of the colonial economy. It means that the establishment of colonial states was followed by the establishment of colonial economy in Africa. The colonial states was an instrument of the colonialists and not the African masses. It means that the colonial state was an instrument of the colonialists and not for the African masses. It was responsible for the exploitation and the operation of the colonies. It means that the colonial states that were established in different countries in Africa were there to ensure or were responsible for the exploitation and the operation of the colonies. So let us see the objectives of the colonial states. What were the objectives of colonial states? The first one was the colonial states was supposedly to provide a link between the colonies and the metropolitan states. It means that the colonial state was supposedly to provide the link between colonies in Africa and the metropolitan states. It had to ensure that the demands of the capitalists are satisfied, such as the acquisition of raw materials and the markets. It means that the main aim of establishment of colonial states in Africa was to ensure that the demands of the capitalists are satisfied or are acquired, such as the acquisition of raw materials for the industries in their homeland and markets for the European manufactured goods in Africa. So that was the objective number one. The second one was the colonial states was supposedly to enforce laws and orders in the country or in the colony. It means that the colonial states was established in order to ensure the enforcement of laws and order in the colony. These laws were supposedly to ensure that the interests of the capitalists are protected. It means that the laws which were established were supposedly the laws were supposedly to ensure that the interests of the capitalists are protected. It means that the laws were there to ensure or to protect the interests of the capitalists within the colony. Laws concerning land alienation and taxation were meant to ensure the exploitation of African resources. It means that laws that were concerning with land alienation and taxation were meant to ensure the exploitation of African resources. As we saw that various land acts and laws were established, as well as tax act or taxation acts which were established to ensure that the Africans or the African resources were exploited. The third one, or the third objective, was the colonial state was supposedly to suppress or control African resistance against the colonialists. It means that another objective was the colonial state was established to ensure or to suppress all resistance or African resistance which could happen in the colony. The suppression of African resistance aimed at ensuring that there is a good atmosphere for the exploitation of African resources. It means that why they suppressed the African resistance, they ensured that there is a good atmosphere or there is good condition in the colony to ensure there is sufficient or intensive exploitation of African resources. This explains why resistance such as Maji Maji, Tanganyika, and Nandi in Kenya had to be defeated at any cost. It means that they fought that resistance or African resistance that were made in order to ensure that the colonial benefits or the colonial interests are protected, and they waged the war at any cost to defeat the African resistance and to be suppressed at all. Another objective was the colonial state was supposedly to construct physical infrastructure such as roads and railways. What were the main functions of those infrastructure? To transport raw materials and laborers from their home to the working stations, and transport the raw materials from the productive areas to the shipping areas. So these were the main aim of physical infrastructure such as road and railway that were established during the colonial rule. These establishments could not be established by individual capitalists. Thus, it was the duty of colonial state to establish them. The roads and railway facilitated the colonial economy of transporting raw materials and the manufactured goods. It means that the raw materials and manufactured goods were transported from the productive areas to the coastal areas, and from the coastal areas to the market areas respectively. So that was the main or another aim of introducing the colonial state. And the fifth was the colonial state was supposedly to supervise colonial production in the colonies. It means that the establishment of colonial states was supposedly to supervise the colonial production in the colonies. It means the objective or the role of supervision of colonial production was under the colonial states. It means to supervise all production in colony. The Africans in the colonies were supposedly to produce cash crops and minerals that were needed in the metropolitan capitalist countries. It means that the Africans in the colonies were supposedly to produce cash crops and minerals that were in high demand in the metropole or in metropolitan capitalist countries. For example, the raw materials or the cash crops were needed in the industries in Europe, as well as minerals were needed in the industries which were established in Europe. Primarily, the colonial economy was supposedly to respond to the demands of the metropolitan economies. The fifth objective was the colonial state was supposedly to provide security and protection to white settlers. It means that the colonial state was supposedly to provide security and protection to the white settlers in the colonies. The colonial states established the judiciary, prisons, and the police. Those were the all instruments which were based in coercion and were responsible for providing protection and security to the white settlers in the colony. The colonial state was imposed on the Africans, thus its received state was imposed on the Africans. Thus it received state was. It means that thus it received resistance from the Africans. It means that the colonial state was imposed on the Africans. Thus it received resistance from the Africans. It means that the colonial state was imposed in order to face or to suppress those African resistance which were occurred in the colonies. So due to the presence of colonial states that were established, the colonial instruments like prisons, police, and the judiciary were there to protect and provide security to the white settlers, as the colonial masters or the colonialists received the African resistance. So they was established in order to suppress those resistance. Thus, the colonial state had to ensure the safety of the whites, not Africans. Oh, that is a big mistake. Of the whites. After looking at the objectives of the colonial states, let us see the significance of agriculture in the colonial economy. Significance of agriculture in the colonial economy. That is the second subtopic. Significance of agriculture in the colonial economy. Significance of agriculture in the colonial economy within African colonies may be seen from the advantages which colonialists got after the establishment of agriculture, and to a less extent Africans also benefited. It means that the significance of agriculture in colonial economy within African colonies may be seen from the advantages that were received by the colonialists, and the low extent that Africans also was benefited or was received. The first significance was agriculture led to colonialists to get raw materials such as cotton, tea, sisal, pythalam, cocoa, and etc. It means that the first significant or advantage of the agriculture in colonial economy was the agriculture led to or made colonialists to attain or to get raw materials such as cotton, tea, sisal, pythalam, and the cocoa that were needed in their industries, that were needed in the capitalistic industries for more development. So that was the significant number one. The second significance was expansion of market for European manufactured goods such as agricultural tools. It means that another significance of agriculture in the colonial economy was the expansion of market for European manufactured goods such as agricultural equipment or tools which were manufactured in Europe and being imported in African colonies. The third one was it destroyed African technology in order to avoid competition with African technology. To me that the agriculture or the significance of agriculture in the colonial economy was it destroyed the African technology in order to avoid the competition with it destroyed African technology in order to avoid the competition with European technology. European technology. It means that the colonial economy, which was established during the colonial era, it means that the Europeans were intensively imported the manufactured goods from Europe in order to kill or to destroy the production of various materials in Africa that could bring the competition with their manufactured goods, or that could bring the competition with their technology. So that's why they decided to destroy African technology, to remove the competition with their technology. Another significant was facilitated exploitation of African resources for the benefit of European capitalists. To mean that the agriculture was facilitated the exploitation of African resources for the benefit of European capitalist resources, being both human and natural resources. To mean that the African resources, both human and the natural resources, were exploited. For example, the human of the people of Africa were forcibly to work on the plantations and the farms which were established by the colonialists, as well as the natural resources like minerals like diamond, copper, silver, gold, and other natural resources were exploited by the colonialists or by the European capitalists. And another one was agriculture boosted the development of industries in Europe. To me, that another significance of agriculture during the colonial economy was agriculture boosted the development of industries in Europe, because industries operated nicely because of enough availability of raw materials. To me, that the development of industries in Europe were there or was witnessed because the industries operated nicely or operated at a large extent because there was enough availability of raw materials that were needed in the industries in Europe. And another significance of agriculture during colonial economy was agriculture led to the construction of social services, like social services infrastructure like schools which prepared African elites such as Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Jomo Kenyatta, and the hospitals. It means that agriculture led to the construction of social services or infrastructures like schools which were provided the colonial education and led to the rise of African elites like Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, and others, as well as other social services like hospitals. Hospitals even now are used to provide health services to the Africans. So that was among of the benefits that the Africans got from colonial economy. Other physical infrastructures like roads, railway were constructed for transportation or transporting raw materials from productive areas to the coast to fulfill the interests of the capitalists. To mean that the other physical infrastructures like roads and railway were constructed for transporting raw materials from the productive areas to the coastal areas where they were ready to be shipped to Europe in order to fulfill the interests of the capitalists. As the colonial states was violent, our colonial states was violent. The main objective of the colonial state was to establish the colonial economy that would respond to the demands of the metropolitan economies. It means that the main objective of the colonial state was to establish the colonial economy that would respond to the interest or to the demand of the metropolitan economies in establishing such economy. The colonialists used the extreme violence, and thus is why many scholars such as Frank Stefano asserted that the colonial state was the most violent. The colonial states used the various measures to ensure that the needs of capitalism or capitalists are met. These measures show that the colonial state was violent. Let us see the measures that show us or evidence or witness that or indicate or manifest that the colonial states were violent in nature. The first one was colonial conquest. Colonial conquest. The colonial states used the military during the establishment of colonial rule. It means that the colonial state used the military during the establishment of colonial rule. It means that the military used it to conquer the African states. Those African societies that put up stiff resistance against the colonialists, the colonial states responded by using the force. It means that those African states that shown or raised the resistance or stiff resistance towards the colonialists, the colonial states responded by the using of force. For example, force was used by the British against the Nant in Kenya and by the government and the Germans against the AA in Tanganyika. It means that the use of force, we can see it in when the colonialists were establishing their rule in Africa in areas like in Kenya. The Nant were imposing a stiff resistance towards the British, and the Germans were, when the Tanganyika were against the colonial rule in Tanganyika by Germans. So the Germans brought or used the force to establish colonial rule in Tanganyika, where there was the resistance. Another measure that indicates that colonial states were violent, colonial states was violent, is acquisition of cheap labor. It means that the colonial states in the acquisition of cheap labor, the colonial state used the violent means to acquire labor. It introduced the various labor laws in Africa to ensure constant supply of labor on economic enterprises. It means that the colonial states established the violent means to acquire the labor who could work in the plantations which were introduced in African states. These labor laws include the expanded system in Kenya and the pass laws in South Africa and Zimbabwe. It means that you can see the systems or the laws which were established in order to ensure the presence of enough labor or supply of labor in economic enterprises. For example, the expanded system which introduced in Kenya that ensured the constant supply of labor in Kenya, especially in the Kikuyu Islands, where there was the production of tea. Also, the pass laws in South Africa and Zimbabwe was established by the British rule to ensure that there is the constant supply of labor. When the Africans failed to provide labor, punishment was meted out. It means that once the Africans failed or once the Africans denied or failed to provide labor, the corporal punishment or the punishment was provided to the Africans. That show or that another show that the colonial state was violent in nature. The another was The colonial policy of land alienation was associated with the use of violence. It means that another measure that can show us that colonial state was violent in nature, it is the land alienation was accompanied with the use of force or violence. Land alienation was supposedly to create room for cash crops production and mining activities. It means that the land alienation was supposedly to create a room for cash crops production and mining activities. And the police used to force people away from their land so that it can be used for colonial production. It means that the colonial state used the police to force people of Africa away from their land so that it can be used by the colonialists in their production, specifically in agricultural production and mining production. Another measure that shows us that colonial state was violent in nature was suppression of African resistance against the colonial economy. Suppression of African resistance against the colonial economy. The colonial state used the force to crush Africans who resisted the establishment of colonial economy. It means that the colonial state used the force to crush Africans who resisted the establishment of colonial economy. The colonial state used the military against the Nama and the Lelo resistance in Namibia and the Maji in Tanganyika. It means that during the suppression of African resistance against the colonial economy, the colonial state used the force to crush or to eliminate the Africans who resisted against the establishment of colonial economy. And the colonial states used the military against the resistance which was occurred or happened, like Nama Elelo resistance in Namibia and the Maji resistance in Tanganyika. Another measure that can show us that colonial state was violent in nature was destruction of African traditional industries. Destruction of African traditional industries. The colonial state destroyed the African traditional industries to ensure that Africa remains a producer of raw materials and a market for European manufactured goods. It means that the colonial states destroyed African traditional industries in order to make Africa to remain as the producer for raw materials and provide the market for the manufactured goods from Europe. The destruction of these industries involved the use of force. It means that the destruction of those industries accompanied with the use of forces. For example, the Belgian Congo, the colonial state decided it was illegal for Africans to engage in handicraft industries. Those who are caught will have their heads chopped off. It means that Belgium in Congo, it means the colony of Belgium in Congo, the colonial state decided it was illegal for Africans to engage in handicraft industries, the production of handicraft products by the Africans. And those who caught involving themselves in handicraft industries, their hands were chopped off or were cut off. Another measure that can show us that the colonial states was violent in nature is that distribution of colonial social services, and the last measure that indicates or manifested that colonial state was violent is distribution of colonial social services. The distribution of colonial social services such as education and health involved the use of violence or psychological. It means that the distribution of colonial social services such as education and health services involved the use of violence. These services were made available only in those areas where the production of raw materials took place. It means that the provision of those social services were made available in those areas where the production activities was taking place. For example, the areas where raw materials were produced. For example, in Tanganyika, there was mainly offered in Arusha, Morogoro, and etc. Those areas that had nothing to offer to the colonialists were danced education. It means that the areas like in Tanganyika, in regions like Arusha, Morogoro, Kagera, those were areas where colonial social services were provided, and areas which had not benefiting the colonialists, nothing they got. So this, I can say that these were the manifestation showing that colonial states were violent in nature. So after looking that, I would like to say that this is the end of our lesson, but I would like to leave the questions which you have to perform. The first question is, analyze the objectives of colonial states during colonial economy in Africa. And the second one is, to what extent the colonial states were considered as violent in nature. So until there, this is the end of our lesson. Thank you for being with me until the end. I welcome you in the next session. Thank you.